Thank you, Katarina, for that lovely introduction, and also thank you for inviting me to present my research. I am really excited to present to a research institute that's also interested in all things rural and countryside. We were just talking to Katarina that my PhD is based in economic geography, and there's not many economic geographers that are interested in agriculture or primary industries or so it's a real treat. Thank you very much. So as Katarina mentioned, my PhD is about resilience, and it's placed within regional economic resilience literature, but I'm trying to approach it rather from the macro perspective. I'm trying to approach it from the perspective of bodies, so having a more feministic approach towards understanding resilience, and also rather than just focusing on economic production, also focusing on social reproduction. Right, so for today's presentation, I'll share my screen, and I hope that all goes fine. Okay, I'm not sure what you can see now.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Let's try again. Okay. How about now?
Yes, if you can put it into presentation mode.
It is. Can you see the presentation mode, or do you see
No. It's
Okay.
we can see the slides, but not in the presentation.
What about now?
Yes, fantastic.
Okay, perfect.
So, yes.
So let me just do this.
you.
All right. So today I'm presenting a. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes. Okay. Perfect. Sorry, something just jumped. So today I'm presenting a paper that I wrote together with Rickard Eriksson and Emily Hanna Weiman. They are both my supervisors and also based here at Umeå University. So the title of the presentation in the paper is Jumping Scales and Producing Peripheries. And in this paper, we're looking at farmers' adaptation strategies in crisis and adversity. Particularly, we are looking at the importance of the cross-scalar networks and how they are utilized as resources by farmers to kind of decrease peripherality, and what happens during crisis when such networks are broken. So theoretically, this paper is based in regional economic resilience literature. Regional economic resilience literature emerged in 2008 as a response to financial crisis, whereas a lot of interest about how regions deal with financial crisis or how regional economic trajectories are affected by crisis or major disturbances. So much of the studies in this field are looking at the regional industrial structures in order to study what kind of structural features support regional economies in dealing with crisis. So, for example, one of the most common approaches to such studies is to compare shock or pre-crisis levels of GDP or employment to post-crisis, respective post-crisis levels, and positive economic growth or upwards economic growth would then kind of deem regional economy resilient. From the spatial ontology perspective, regions are kind of looked upon in terms of absolute spaces or as containers, and regions are defined by their administrative units, which kind of makes sense, and I'll get to that point later on. Another criticism that has also been raised within this field of literature is that while we are essentially aiming to understand regional economic resilience, much of how we theorize or think about regions derives from the perspective of selected firms. So the questions like, is it really a regional economic resilience, or rather a resilience or development trajectories of certain firms? So kind of these studies predominantly focus on structural features and structural regional features. There has been interest in the agency perspective, also looking at how agentic forces contribute to the regional economic development, and also how can agentic forces be observed at the regional scale. So in this paper, we wanted to look at how individuals adopt the economic crisis. So instead of looking how regional or how individual agency or actions affect or can be observed at the regional scale, we were rather interested in how individuals deal with crisis from their geographical position to serve their needs and interests, rather than kind of assuming that economic growth benefits all, or that regional development agendas can also be applied to individual adaptation objectives and strategies. And finally, since we're also we're focusing on individuals, we didn't want just to look at economic production, but we also, and I think this is also where our own positionality comes to affect our research. All of us, the authors, come from rural areas, and we grew up in rather peripheral places, and we know the importance of kind of social reproduction of these everyday micro practices that often go unnoticed or are really difficult to capture as variables. So we also wanted to incorporate the social reproduction, and I'll come to this during the next slide. So with that in mind, of how regional economic resilience studies being conducted, and with our wish to kind of focus on the individuals and look at what this does mean from the individual perspective, we wanted to make several theoretical interventions. So first, we wanted to acknowledge the role of social reproduction. And social reproduction, we define it as, we draw from Sidney Katz, and we define it as, who defines it as everyday practices, those often taken for granted, little micro acts and habits, and that are present within everydays. So this is, so apart from just focusing on kind of economic production, which has traditionally dominated the field, we also wanted to acknowledge social production. Secondly, and this is a very geographical intervention, we wanted to have a relational understanding of space and regions. Here we draw a lot from Massey. And since we are looking at individuals, and individuals are part of spatially broad networks, spatially broad relations that can easily and do transcend the regional administrative bounds. So we wanted to account also for that. And finally, we wanted to politicize resilience. This has also been one of the criticisms of resilience in economic geography, that questions like resilience for who, and resilience for can we equally talk about resilience of region, thinking that regions are this myriad of different actors. So then the research questions that we have in this paper is, what social structures do individuals seek to preserve and reproduce during crisis, and how do they accomplish this? So networks and social production suddenly became the two cornerstones of our two theoretical cornerstones for us to answer the research question. And in this paper, we use to kind of incorporate both concepts, both networks and social reproduction. We use Cox's concepts of spaces and dependence and spaces of engagement. Now, for him, spaces of dependence are those immediate material and social places that we people depend on. So for example, if we are looking at individual spaces, dependence are basically our homes. These are the places that possess both social and material assets that we need for realizing our essential needs. These are places, if we're looking at individuals, these are places where we live, these are places where we can work, these are the places where we have our families. So these are places that represent our both material and social investments. On the other hand, space of engagement are produced when actors experiencing a problematic relation to a space of dependence construct a network of association, a space of engagement through which to achieve some mitigation. So in other words, a space of engagement are networks that people engage in order to address an issue, whereas their own immediate geographies where in case where their own immediate geographies or space of dependence don't suffice. And I think one of the really good examples in space of engagement, often referred to as jumping scales, is we can see that often political protests take place in the capital cities or in bigger cities, because this is the scale or this is the place where there's a potential and opportunity to get the most attention. So spaces of dependence, just again, kind of recap again. So space of dependence are those places that possess both our material or represent our material, social investments and needs. And then spaces engagement are basically those networks, cross-scalar social networks that we construct in order to support and maintain our space of dependence. So these are our So these were our theoretical considerations for the paper. So how did we approach it empirically? So I'm sure some of you might have, many of you heard about what happened in Denmark in 2020 with the mink farming case. So before 2020, November 2020, Denmark was one of the biggest exporters of mink skin pelts in the world. They were accounting for around 36% of all exported mink skin pelts. There were around 800 farms in Denmark, and most of them were located on Jutland. I'm going to show a map in the next slide. Most of them were located in an area often referred to as rotten banana area. Kind of firstly because of its kind of size, it looks like a banana, but also secondly because mostly because of the social factors such as out-migration, depopulation, and lack of economic opportunities. Mink farming or mink skin pelts were also the third largest animal export in Denmark. And here, of course, the exports varied every year. But for example, if you look at the exports of 2019, Denmark exported around 24.5 million pelts. When it comes to employment on mink farms, it's really difficult to kind of assess it, but because depending on the period of the year, so during some more intense periods, mink farmers would hire additional labor. For example, during the pelting season in November, they would hire a lot additional labor, mostly immigrants from Eastern Europe, to help with the pelting process. But other than that, an average farm had 1 to 2 workers, 1 to 2 workers every day. More about mink farming. It operated as a cooperative. So, for example, they had and owned local, regional, and national Danish fur breeders associations. With the National Fur Breed Association then having their offices in Copenhagen and acting as a central advocacy group. A National Fur Breed Association was also very active in contesting images about mink farming at the national and international scale, since it is a very controversial and ethically concerning industry. They were basically acting like a little embassy, but also oversaw a lot of administrative financial issues. Also feed production centers. Then Danish mink breeders were known to be the best in the world, which is also has to do a lot with the genetic code and breeding expertise that they've developed over the years since 1930s. That's when the first mink farms appeared in Denmark. And one key aspect to a quality fur is the feed. So mink farmers also, they owned their own feed production centers, which gave them more control over the quality of feed and also the prices. So apart from these industrial structural features, mink farming was also a family business. When I started the interviews, I had this idea that there's a kind of the owner of the farm, which is on the paper, but then during the interviews, it became really quickly that it's a family business because to some extent, all family members were involved with their kids or spouses or their own parents, and all the farmers that we interviewed had all but one had inherited their farms, mink farms, from their parents. And there was one farmer that was fourth generation mink farmer. So it's also a kind of family business that has been in generations for many, many decades. So what happened in 2020, some farms in July 2020, some farms in the north of Denmark got infected by COVID. And then basically all the way up till November, the government tried to mitigate the case to decrease the spread and to decrease and contain the spread. However, in November 4, the government announced a decision that all the mink in the country, both healthy and unhealthy, have to be cooled off. And of course, this was a very sudden decision, and nobody really expected it, and it caused major unrest among mink farmers. Also, on the day of press conference when government announced their decision, they also promised a compensation package, which also came out 2 months later. And the compensation package provided mink farmers with two options. Option one would be to enter some sort of economic hibernation state, where state would reassume the maintenance costs for a duration of 2 years, because apart from ordering at a nationwide cool-off, they also introduced 2-year breeding ban. So first option would be to enter economic hibernation and then resume business breeding after the ban is lifted again. The second option was to sell all the assets, production assets, to the state, and you lose the opportunity to start breeding again. So basically exit the industry. And most farmers chose the second option, with only around a handful, 10 or 13 farmers who just restarted breeding again last year. And there are different reasons, we can talk about it later if we have time, as to why most decided to exit. Yes, okay. So just to show you some photos on from mink farming from our field trip. So we've done 13 semi-structured interviews and farm visits with mink farmers. All but one were male respondents. Age ranged from 26 to 62. So there's both younger generation mink breeders that inherited their farms or bought part of their parents' farms. And then there are also older farmers. Here you can see in the top left corner and top and bottom left corner, you can see there are two different types of farms. One is the more traditional, which you can see at the bottom left corner, where you have two rows of cages on both sides. And the other is more kind of modern farming infrastructure, where you have these big buildings, and it has several rows of cages. It was also an industry that was that had a lot of were farmers, a lot of pride, professional pride, and sense of belonging. And there were several farmers that had tattoos, as you can see on the right corner. And here, if you look at the map in the center, this is basically the placement of mink farms, and you can see that Jutland, that big island, the west coast of it, this is where most farms are located, and you can see where the kind of rotten banana area kind of title comes from. This whole west coast, it's a very mostly rural areas. Major centers in Denmark are around east coast, and then so farms where most of the mink farms were located by the coast, also because that's where they were in close proximity to fishing industry, which was major part of major component of mink feed. Maybe we can come back to these pictures later when we talk about results. But so what we wanted to do, we wanted to look at, since we in this paper wanted to see what are the social infrastructures and structures that individuals seek to preserve. So we looked at our results and we wanted to identify the spaces of dependence for among mink farmers. So in a way, answer the question, resilience to what end? So look at what are those social material investments that make these places both dear for those farmers, but also difficult to replace or substitute by other places. So first, there's a lot, of course, material and social investments by owning a farm. So as you can see on the quote on the right, where the farmer is discussing, where talks about how he would never even imagine to moving somewhere else, because first he really enjoys the nature that is around his house, the lake, and he also mentions his wife that has a good job in nearby town, and also his children that have a good school. So here you can see that there's of course material investments like machinery, equipment, farms, and that kind of tie them to this place. But there's also more than that. There's also kind of family commitments, like schools and jobs for spouses that also make these places that make them dependent on these places. Second, one thing that we also noticed with mink farmers is that all the mink farmers we interviewed, their farms were located right outside their homes. And so suddenly there's not really a clear-cut dichotomy between a working life or private life. This suddenly becomes very kind of fluid. And it also became clear that it is such a like embedded, mink farming was such an embedded practice within family life. Here you can see the farmer in the quote is talking about how he and his son used to talk about selecting minks during the dinner table, something that they'd done during the day. Selecting minks is basically you select minks for breeding. So you have to, depending on what kind of mink breed you want to achieve, this where's kind of the selecting expertise come in. And one of the things that we noticed that kids, those mink farmers that had kids, their kids have joined them on farms from very early age. And it doesn't necessarily have to be, the kids would always come to farms, does not necessarily to be helpful, but it always started as a fun way to spend time with their kids. And then as kids grew up, then they would get more and more responsibilities, or they would get more and more involved, but they grew up in these farms. And in a way, being part of industries like mink farming that is very contested and outdated, and also perhaps it would be a matter of time before mink breeding also in Denmark would close. But then, in a way, having children and passing down the knowledge on breeding to children is also one way to ensuring the reproduction of industry, and also kind of reproducing the skills and knowledge associated with it. So in a way, it is also part of industrial resilience. Also, during what we noticed is talking about social reproduction, during the busier periods at farms, what happened is that the farmers' spouses then would have to take a more active role in childcare or labor care, which would again give the farmers more time to be at the farm. So these are again something that economic geography and resilience studies have not really acknowledged, that all this invisible labor that goes into sustaining an economic activity. And I think it becomes very obvious particularly when we talk about farming life, where the whole division between work life and personal life is not as clear, because it literally shares the same space. And finally, there's also a lot of close bond and companionship among mink farmers that are in the same geographical vicinity. For example, here a farmer on the right in the quote is talking that he and other farmers would meet every Friday to have lunch or to have coffee. And of course, these meetings served multiple purposes. For once, it's a way to feel connected and feel kind of increased sense of belonging to a community. But it also served more practical purposes, such as exchanging information about where to buy equipment or breeders to buy livestock from, or it was also be a good way to share resources. Some of the equipment is very expensive, so a lot of farmers would share costs for equipment. So we could kind of looking at space of dependence, or looking at what makes these places special. We can see that farms, of course, there's a lot of kind of professional identity connected to it, but farms a lot act as some sort of proxy to other things. It's also a way to take care of your family. It's also a way to connect to other people in the area and also outside it. That just kind of brings attention. There's both social, but also not just material investment, but also a lot of social investment. So next we wanted to look at the space of engagement or the networks that mink farmers engage in order to overcome adversities. And here with this section of results, we divided into two parts. First, we look at the networks that mink farmers engaged during smaller scale adversities. And then we look at how these networks translated to, or the kind of the effectiveness of these networks during the closure of farms. So mink farming, apart from the total closure and cool-off of minks, mink farming throughout the years was exposed to also several smaller scale adversities. So, for example, there's no minimum set price for mink skin pelt. So there's constant every 7 or so years, there's supply and demand imbalance, which made it really difficult for mink farmers to adjust their investment. Secondly, there's also a lot of diseases associated with mink. There's one in particular, blood disease called plasmacytosis. In case a mink farm got infected by it, the mink farmer would have to cool off all their stock and stop breeding for 1 year, clean the farm, and then start again next year. And of course, it's a very controversial industry, so there's also a lot of animal activists and animal welfare groups that were pushing both, putting pressure internationally and nationally to close mink farming. So, but first we looked at those smaller scale crises, and the reason we distinguish or kind of look at first at smaller adversities and then at the crisis shutdown, we wanted to see how those networks kind of translate and how they changed. We identified two types of networks that we grouped in informal and institutionalized. And informal networks are those that kind of unfolded among the mink farmers through Facebook groups, through more personal contacts. And institutionalized networks were those that existed through membership through local breed associations or regional or national. So we see that when we look at the smaller scale adversities, that mink farmers were really good at maintaining their networks through Facebook groups, through personal contacts, through exhibitions. Every year they organize several exhibitions to determine the best breeders in specific mink breed categories. There were also courses organized by local and regional and national associations. And there were also working groups that were bottom-up initiatives from the farmers themselves to meet in different working groups to discuss issues or different issues. And there were so many working groups, and an average mink farmer could be part of like 2 or 3. And here particularly we see through these networks, because they were not only limited to the immediate geographies where mink farmers, or to space of dependence, they were all over the country. And I think mink farmers themselves, they often acknowledge that it's really good to talk to someone else in a different municipality about how they address a specific issue, because there was this understanding that everybody here does things the same. So it's really good to talk to other spaces. And I think when we talk about networks, sometimes there's this understanding that there exists somewhere there out there. But I think mink farmers in Denmark here were really good at materially maintaining the networks. And what I mean by this is that apart from having networks and being part of a certain group, they were also really good at physically meeting and facilitating it so that they would actually physically meet. Second, we also saw that a central advocacy group, the Danish Fur Breeders Association, they were also handling issues that were kind of bigger picture issues such as dealing with the press, dealing with the resource allocation, dealing with animal welfare protocols. For example, I mentioned this price and supply and demand imbalance. One of the reasons why it was kind of out of balance every 7 years is because China is also a major player in mink skin, mink pelt production. And it was really difficult to know exactly how much is produced every year in China, which made it kind of difficult then for Danish breeders to adjust their investments. And here you see the national Danish Fur Breed Association that would travel and do this research in order to provide some sort of estimates. And finally, we also see a lot of local networks. So often when we talk about scale jumping, there's this understanding that there's a hierarchy, that national is higher than the local. But this is not always the case. It doesn't have to be. What we see is that there was also a lot of local networks. For example, mink farmers collaborated with schools, where they invited schools to school children to come and see what a life is on mink farms. And this was also done to kind of contest the general idea that life on mink farms is terrible for the animals. And so they didn't only open their farms for the schools, but they also opened them up for tourists to kind of show the realities or show the situation or the life on mink farms. So then we looked at those networks or during the shutdown, and there's one thing that immediately became clear is that suddenly the informal networks were not engaged in as much. Suddenly it all became about a central advocacy group, the National Fur Breeders Association, that was handling everything. And there's different reasons for that, of course. First, when it comes to smaller scale adversities, it might have been maybe 1 or 2 farmers here and there that were affected by it, but it didn't affect the whole group. With this sudden shock and the closure of mink farms on the 4th of November, suddenly it was all of the farmers that were affected simultaneously. So then it became really important that there is a central advocacy group that can advocate for their needs. And it already became quite clear on the 4th of November that most farmers will exit the industry and not come back to it. And so then it became not so much about the role of this the role of the National Fur Breeders Association then didn't become about preserving the industry. It was rather about giving mink farmers as good of exit conditions as possible. I think, and then when you see that all the central power lies in central places like Copenhagen, the capital, it can brings attention that how geographical peripheries are also economical and political peripheries. And talking again about the central advocacy group, yesterday I had a follow-up interview with one of the mink breeders, and my initial plan when I started my PhD was to do the first round of interviews, and then after 2 years, do a second round of interviews, thinking that by that time they will have received their compensation, so they will be able to, so I would be able to see what have they been up to and how they have kind of rearranged and reorganized their lives. Well, yesterday I talked to one mink farmer, and he told me that out of around 1,200 farmers. Only 50 have received the money. The rest are still waiting. And now there's a lot of political, it's become a political issue and a scandal. And it is actually still Copenhagen, the National Fur Breed Association, that is still active in making sure that farmers get compensation. Some concluding thoughts. So again, resilience to what end? We try to look at, in this paper, we try to look at what are the structures that individuals seek to preserve in this case, mink farmers or farming communities, and by what means they do it. And one of the reasons why I think it's also interesting that this is a mink farming case is because, of course, it's a very contested and controversial industry. And often when we talk about resilience, and the question emerges, well, resilience of who? Are we talking about resilience of mink industry? Because that would, of course, wouldn't fit in the kind of broader debate on sustainability of the broader society. But I think looking and thinking of farms as proxies and what they actually mean for those involved in mink farming, that it's also a way to take care of the family, it's also a way to connect to people, then suddenly brings attention from, instead of preserving mink farming, rather than preserving the livelihoods of people in those more rural areas. And I also think it's a more safer ground for public debates, because and this is not just mink farmers in that sense. Generally, a lot of farmers feel that pressure from the government, that they are not understood, that it's really difficult for them to change their practices. So I think just focusing that this is, instead of, at least within mink farming communities, suddenly looking at what farms are proxies for, it also kind of shifts the discussion towards preserving livelihoods rather than specific industries. So in that way, we try to disassociate resilience from a particular industry or workplace here. Next, it also, our paper shows that for people in geographical peripheries, these socio-spatial networks serve as resources for individuals. And again, I talked about materiality, not just networks as in that I'm part of an industry, but also as active maintenance of these networks through actually meeting and facilitating kind of meeting points. Also, we showed that social production, understood as daily habits and social relations, support economic production and increase individual resilience. Again, all these micro practices, by involving your children into mink farming, making sure that there's continuity, or whenever spouses have to take more active role in domestic labor, this also has an effect on the economic production. And finally, I've been talking for long now, but finally, I think resilience as a concept is used across many different fields, and geography is one of them. And my PhD is based in geography. So then the question is, how can geography as a field contribute to resilience, and particularly regional resilience? And I think as geographers, we have one of the tools that we have to understand social phenomena of any kind is spatial ontology and scale. How do we approach space, regions? Do we think of space more in absolute terms or more relative or relational terms? And it's not to say that one is better than the other. It's just how different perspectives of spatial ontology can help us understand something. And in resilience studies, when we look at regions and when we conceptualize regions through a relational lens, when we look at the networks, it becomes clear that network detachment amplifies peripheralization for actors in declining activities in already geographically distant areas, which in turn brings attention that peripherality is produced and is a relational position rather than the ontologically given feature. All right, I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much.
you very much, Sania. It was really, really interesting. So thank you for this interesting presentation. I can see that there are no, oh, maybe I should start the video here. There are no questions in the chat. So is there anyone that would like to sort of start the discussion and got questions? Is there claps here? So well done.
Can it was just a comment really about your very last concluding slide about when you said about using mink farming study as a proxy for other farms. I was thinking that most of the way through. I thought, apart from obviously the dramatic scale that the mink farms were, you know, reduced, I was like, you could pretty much change the word mink farming to livestock farming or, you know, chicken farming or anything like that, and you'd probably get do you feel you'd get fairly similar sort of results back in the, you know, there is just so many pressures on any type of farming, especially when huge sort of shocks in the industry like that happen. Obviously that's on a very dramatic scale, but I just thought that is, you know, it is a very relevant point to say that that can be used as a proxy for any other farming.
Yeah, it is. I'm also working with a colleague from Lund University, and he's also working with cow and pig farms. We found a lot of synergies, and I think so one of the ways of looking at farms as proxies for constructing livelihoods is also a safer ground to have a debate, because right now one of the issues is particularly dealing with mink farming, but again, it's the case with other farming activities as well, is that as soon as you mentioned farming or mink farming or cow farming, it's so contested. It's not anymore just an economic activity, because everybody has so many opinions about it. So it's a it's become a political issue, and I agree that I think a lot of farming communities, regardless of the kind of the trade, will have similar trajectories. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I mean, there is a similar question from Julie, sort of asking what is distinctive about mink, and could these findings relate to other livestock farms?
Yes, I mean, different ways to answer that question with what is this thing about mink in terms of agriculture, for example, in the Danish context, is that mink, there's no minimal set price. So in a way, for example, milk cow farmers, they are somewhat protected by the government in Denmark by having a minimal price, whereas not the case with mink farming. But what is distinct, what is similar, and how this could relate? It's a great question, because when I started, I thought that mink farmers are very distinct because there's more kind of hate and disapproval towards mink farming as practice. But I think I was surprised to find out that many other farmers, regardless of whether it's cow or pig farming, they experience very similar opposition from the society. So in that sense, I think how is this research applicable to other to kind of broader context? I think it has to do with, in light of sustainability transitions, where farmers are expected to adjust their farming practices and change a lot. I think we need to find a way of better talking, understanding with farmers, because it seems that there is a huge dichotomy in how on-ground realities of what farmers must deal with, and also at the national or international levels, where a lot of laws and regulations are made about what is actually happening. So I think it's about finding a more constructive way of communicating, because we can see that farmers are protesting all over Europe. They find it really difficult to implement those changes. Not necessarily because they don't want to, but it's just it's very difficult to be a small-scale farmer.
Thank you very much. Is there any other question? Anyone would like to raise a question?
Yeah, I've got a question. So I'm interested in what you're saying about resilience, and I'm interested in why you chose to look at regional resilience. And if you thought that the farms had any sort of links to community resilience as well, and why you chose to look at regional resilience rather than like scales like the community. And do you think that's sort of a scale that's jumped in the way that you were talking about, or yeah, just if you had any reflections on those other scales, really?
Yes, thank you. It's a brilliant question. So the reason I chose I stick to regional resilience, it's how we define how do we define regions. I believe and I think that through that people in different communities, they're also part of regional economy. So I understand I could look at, let's say, community resilience and just focus on that. I think being based in in kind of geographical discipline, what I'm trying to essentially kind of underneath it all, I'm trying to study how do individual voices matter for the regional spatial dynamics. So I don't want to, in a way, I'm trying to bring the individual voices out and kind of study and link them to also saying that this is also part of regional dynamics, regional development. It's not just the firms that are kind of constructing the whole regional images. So I think underneath it all, I'm trying to find a way and to bring out more individual voices and think that they're also part of regional economies.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions? Can I ask in the meantime, I mean, you've mentioned that the majority of the farmers decided to exit the industry. So what maybe were the main sort of reasons? Because obviously this got an impact on the local economy and impact on a very huge impact on the individual levels. So as far as the future goes, what was maybe the thinking behind this?
So exactly. So when they announced the national cool-off, they also said that all the main healthy and unhealthy have to be cooled off, which also included the mother animals that contain the genetic code of Danish bred mink breeds. And that kind of started a whole domino effect. Suddenly, the reason Denmark was competitive, it was because of that genetic pool. It would be impossible, but there are some Danish mink available in Danish bred mink available in Iceland. It would be impossible to supply all the farmers in Denmark with it, which would mean less farmers, which would mean more difficult to upkeep and maintain the cooperative structure, feeding centers. It basically changed the whole structure. So it will be possible to breed mink, yes, but it will be a very different industry.
Thank you very much. Are there any other questions anyone else would like to sort of ask? Because we will have to wrap up soon. So if there is no questions, then thank you very much, Sania. Oh, well, I've got one new message, so I'll just check that. Well, it's just a thank you. So really, thank you very much for a very interesting and thought-provoking presentation. And thank you for everyone who sort of attended. And please follow the CCRI website for update on other seminars. And the recording would be obviously made available on our YouTube channel as well as the slides. So thanks again, Sania, and
Thank you. Thank you
have
very
a
much.
nice rest of the day, all of you. Bye then.
Bye. Thank you.